Welcome to the Centurion's Path, a podcast about the life and the trials and tribulations of those who serve. This podcast is about the heroes who protect our communities. To truly understand the path of the protector, tune in with AJ DeAndrea and John McDonald, two nationally known leaders who live the Centurion's Path every day.
Thank you all for joining us today. To our sponsor for today's podcast, Safe Haven Defense. Preserving property, protecting lives, providing peace of mind.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to this episode of the Centurion's Path. AJ and I are back. We've got a really special guest today, and we're just excited to be here. I haven't caught up with you in a while. AJ, how you been?
I've been good, but I've been crazy busy, as I'm sure you have been as well. Actually, I had a little hiatus. I was home for almost 2.5 weeks, which has been kind of unheard of here lately. Stepping into a busy fall, but excited because you're coming to Denver on the 29th. We're going up to see you to watch my Buffaloes play your Bison.
Hey, North Dakota State, right? Excited about watching them play CU. It'll be a lot of fun.
It's going to be a hoot. So
I may be the only NDSU fan in the whole stadium. I'll be representing.
Oh, I doubt it. Yeah. You'll be surprised. But hey, what a great day. Well, before I introduce our guest, John, how about you? Anything you want to catch us up on?
Been really busy in the last week. I trained 4,000 educators. So my voice is pretty well shot, but it's been a good week of training and preparing everybody for the next school year and the chaos that always comes with it. So, that's what I've been up to.
Well, Did you, I know we were both excited because we're rolling out officially now the Evacuate, Evade, Defend into the school districts. And I got an opportunity to train one of our local school districts here. And I know that you, hopefully yours went well.
We're going to be rolling that out pretty quickly. In fact, I think for, across the country, this is going to be a brand new protocol that is accessible to everybody through your program and Evacuate, Evade, Defend just changes the world from run, hide, fight. And it stands up, I think, a mentality and a mindset that is so important for people. And we can't wait to roll it out across the country. I know we worked with you on developing the artwork for the program, and we've got some ideas on how to roll it out with marketing videos, and so we're excited to help you launch that program.
Well, good things are coming, right?
Yeah.
All right. So it is my honor to introduce our guest, Mark Bouchard you're in Ottawa now, correct?
Yeah. Just got out here a few months ago.
All right. And we're going to talk a little bit just about his book, which put it up here, right? Setting My Sights on Stigma, Thoughts from an Injured Mind. And Mark and I have had a lot of conversations about mental health and, dealing with that, the trials and tribulations of this job, what we go through. How to take care of ourselves a little better, and I'm really excited. But before we get into the book and some of the things in that, Mark, why don't you introduce yourself to our listeners, and so they have an idea who you are and a little bit about your life, your career, and then we'll just kind of see where this thing goes.
Yeah, awesome. Well, let me just start out by saying thank you. Like, what an honor, both John and AJ. I've listened to all your episodes. I really look up to you for the impact and the good you're having in the world, and it really matters. So it's a real honor to be on here, so thank you. For my background, I've been a police officer, started as a volunteer in about 2005, got hired as a regular officer in 2007. It was a municipal agency. It's called the Delta Police Department, a suburb of Vancouver. I did that until 2020 when I joined the RCMP. So I transferred to Canada's National Police Force. And we basically fill a lot of roles. So we do like the local policing, like, your city police, but we also do a provincial, kind of like a state mandate. And then we have federal, like, international security, terrorism, and ultimately my role in that largely has been on our SWAT capacity, which in Canada we'd call Emergency Response Team. So same thing, we call it ERT. And within ERT, we have specialty profiles, just like SWAT down in the US, right? Breachers and snipers and stuff. And mine was a medic. So I have about 10 years in our medic program. And I just got a promotion into our national tactical medicine program. So there's 2 spots across the country that help to coordinate that for about 150 tactical medics across the country. And I just have so much passion for that and for trying to save my buddies that I got into doing that. And as I was developing my passion for the medic side, like I really treated it like one day I'm going to use this to save one of my best friends. But then as I learned more about the mental health side of the job, I started to understand, wow, like that's actually what the stats say, where we can save the most lives and have the most impact. And personally, I went through my own severe, PTSD, mental health challenges, whatever we want to call it. I call it a psychological injury. But I hit a point where I was off work on stress leave, really unable to function in life. And I have about 40 pages worth of journaling from that time that I shared with one of my mentors on our emergency response team. And at first I never would have let anyone read it. I was worried he'd share it with anyone. But then I realized one of the best things we can do is actually to reduce the stigma, to share the hardship of what we go through, but more importantly, the path to healing. Because there was so much good science, and that's why I broke my book down in chapters of what lessons I learned. And there's so much good science that can help us to heal. We don't need to be injured, and we can go through really hard things, but then we can actually take action to try and maintain our health. And I just wanted to help get that out there in the culture. I ultimately didn't have the power to fully change it within my organization. I was just a frontline constable, like the base level cop doing the job. And I just decided to write a book so that I could try and share it outside of that.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable, really. And you talk about, we can't choose. We can be victimized, right? We can be victimized, but we don't have to be a victim. And I got a lot of that as I'm kind of reading your book. If we understand kind of what happens with us as we're going through some of this stuff, we can actually come out, potentially better on the other end if we pay attention, and it becomes a priority for us to actually hit it head on and deal with it. And I was enthralled really as I started reading some of your journal entries, right? And the power in that, the power in going from, it's here in my head and I need a place to put it, right? And Dr. Nicoletti talks a lot about the Book of the Dead, and those are those incidents that we get involved in. And we all have our own chapters, and we all deal with it a little bit differently, but it helps compartmentalize that when we can actually go from thought to the actual movement of the hand, writing it down, it actually puts it in the right place in that Book of the Dead that lives there in our head.
Yeah, absolutely. For me, when I was first diagnosed with PTSD, I would describe that I was like a victim to my diagnosis. I went from thinking I could do anything to that I was useless and broken and never going to be able to do anything, and that I would be stuck in that terrible place forever. And honestly, I was suffering. So then you have this perception that you'll just suffer forever and that you're a failure. Like, what's wrong with me? My buddies went to the same calls I did. They're all still at work. Like, what's wrong with me? And as I learned to take some control back, like ultimately you can heal from trauma, from emotional pain. And I think what you were saying at the start there is that we can actually grow through hardship, right? There's almost like we use the term resilience as though it's going back to what you were. And when we go through things that are severely hard, we often can't go back to who we were, but we can try and grow through that and actually find a way to make some good out of that in our life. And that you gain a strength, it's like a workout, right? If we just try and bench press 500 pounds, it's going to crush anybody. But there's people who work up to that because they go under a stress and then they build, like they take the time to actually heal. But it's not just time. It's actually taking actions to get better. And so like I was really hesitant to even try journaling. The only reason I did it, one of my mentors said it to me, and I had so much trust in him. And he just said, send me an email. You don't even need to hit send. It's the good is in the action of the typing. And now as I've studied all these different psychologists, I've actually understood more of the science behind it of like, wow, just that ability to take how we feel and actually express it. Whether we express it directly to someone and we talk to them, whether we just write it, And sometimes it's things like expressing it in art and in all kinds of other ways. So just that ability to, because so often we end up shaming ourselves for our feelings. So we go do these hard things. We have this perception that if, say, you're a cop, okay, I'm going to be RoboCop. I go do this terrible thing. I see horrible suffering, and I take off my police hat an hour later, and I go back to just being smiling and happy. And it's not true, right? And that really rocked me. I was 2 months into the job, did a bad next of kin notification from a terrible car crash of, 2 young women, and I had to go tell their families that one of them had died. And I thought I would just take off my police hat and pretend like nothing had happened after. And I was so wrong. It really stuck with me for like 10 years. But then when I found things like journaling and, seeing a therapist and a lot of other things that you can do for free. It's not just, well, I don't have the money, I can't go talk to someone. Go get out in nature, work on your breathing, prioritize your sleep. Honestly, cut out alcohol. Like, we hesitate to say it, but it's the truth. Alcohol is really toxic to your brain. And if you want to heal from your trauma, those are all things you can do, many of which are free, that will help you as you're recovering.
Totally. And I got to go back here because I think John warms up at 500 pounds. So
yeah, right.
But no,
those days are long gone.
And the thing that I've noticed, and I'm sure you noticed this throughout your career, and John, you can step in on this as well, but you were always taught, right, that you can't have emotions. You shouldn't have emotions. Don't be passionate. Just be, like you said, RoboCop. Just be this rote individual that goes through. And I think for the majority of people, that actually becomes a little bit detrimental. It's okay to have emotion. It's okay to let those emotions out, right? Of course, in a positive way. It's okay to be passionate. It's okay to care. And we get taught, from an early age, even in the academy, that, we're just supposed to go out there and force the law. Don't, just move forward. But it's okay to be human. Just because you put the badge on doesn't mean that now you're not a human, right? And I think some of our best cops are those that have that passion and emotion and are able to care and keep the human side involved. And that doesn't mean you got to go, run around and being, anything different than who you are, but just being yourself and the ability to do that and to keep those things central to your core. And we're not dual people. We're one person, right? And when we become dual people, where this is just the job, this is just who I am at this moment, that doesn't translate over then when we try to get into our personal lives. And when we can kind of keep those things fluid, right? I think we're a lot more successful.
Yeah. Well, sorry, go ahead, John.
No, I'm just thinking back to something. I think back in 1990, I had my first death investigation call that I ever had as a young rookie cop, first month on the job. And we're standing around, and the deceased is in his garage, and we're there for a long time waiting for the coroner. And the conversation starts about, hey, let's order a pizza. And, as a 21-year-old cop, very new on the job, not understanding, and thinking how that still imprints on my mind today, all these years later. I just remember looking at everybody saying, nobody's showing any emotion. This is like normal stuff. And there's nothing normal about it at that moment in time. But I remember thinking, well, nobody else is showing emotion. I can't be shocked by this either, even though I was pretty shocked. And somewhere along the way, it went from being a stigma to being okay to now talk about, being okay to have conversations about. And at the time, if you said you wanted to go see somebody to talk things out, they'd look at you like you're crazy. And you just didn't do that. And I think that caused a lot of problems. But that was kind of the environment that we lived in at the time. I find that, now today I work with a lot of parents of murdered kids, and I'm a lot more emotional about it. And I'm okay with that because there's nothing good about that and there's nothing right about that. So, I find the whole conversation to be empowering. And that term post-traumatic growth in the last couple of years, I've heard that more and more and more. It really is a growth of trying to figure out how you get from A to Z and what that path is. So I don't know if any of that makes sense, but as you're talking about this, I'm going back in my mind to past incidents and how that imprints, and then how do you walk that path of keeping yourself right. And you talk a lot about mentors, Mark. I mean, the people that it's a relationship business, so the people that you connect with, they're the people that are standing there with you, helping to save your life.
Yeah, absolutely. I think too, we often attribute the healing of these kind of things to time. That like, oh, well, time will heal it. And I would disagree. I don't think it is time. Like for me, that fatal crash I described, 10 years later, that I was still traumatized by that. And I'm not anymore, but it's because instead of kind of trying to hide from it and run away from it, I actually went towards it. So my chapter on trauma, which is really about finding post-traumatic growth or how to grow out of that hardship, the number one tool that I write is to take action. It's just, you need to do something to try and help yourself, because what each of us need might be different, right? And sometimes it's talk therapy. Sometimes it's more like an EMDR, in case if anyone hasn't heard of that. Basically, it's a procedure, or it's a thing you can do with a counselor where they, like use bilateral stimulation. Ultimately, often it's following a finger or pen or something from side to side. And I'll say, like, my psychologist tried to get me to try that. And I said, you can't make me try your voodoo BS, right? Because that's how I felt with a stigma about, oh, I don't want to try. That sounds weird. But if only someone had taught me about it ahead of time, it wouldn't have been so weird. And I've talked to lots of cops, and the topic of EMDR will come up, and they'll say things like, yeah, I tried that. And like within a week or within a few sessions, all of a sudden everything was just gone. Like I just got better. And it is like voodoo in a way. But again, everyone is different. Everyone's experience is different. Their trauma can be different. So we shouldn't rely on just one size fits all. But what I do recommend is be willing to try something, because I was a victim to my diagnosis and I felt like a victim. And as soon as I saw that I had a little bit of control, and for me, one of those things was to stop drinking. Like I would say I probably couldn't stop drinking. I woke up one morning at 9 a.m. on a Tuesday and it felt terrible. And I'm like, man, I need to quit drinking. And I had this realization, I can't. And then I had to shrink my goal down to like an hour. Okay, can you go an hour without drinking? It's 9 a.m. Yeah, I can go an hour. Because usually I would start drinking at night because I knew the nightmares were coming. But again, no one teaches us this stuff, right? I know what I needed in 2007 as a new cop about emotional pain and trauma and nightmares, but no one talked about it. It was just this silent thing we didn't talk about. And I think especially for us as men, right? You got to, when we're talking about culture, we're often brought up with this, like, boys don't cry, men don't cry. And I can't tell you how often I've talked to a member of the public who's a man who's gone through something severe, loss of their parent, loss of their child, like devastating things. And they'll be saying things to me like, I don't know what's wrong with me. I don't know why I'm such a little wimp, blah, blah, blah. Like I look at me crying and I'm like, man, like you're going through such emotional pain. Like it's okay to be human. It's okay to have emotion. One of the sayings I like is person first, cop second, right? Like I think we have this idea that I'm going to put on a uniform and we take on what we perceive from the culture. So I'll give you an example. What does a cop usually say when they describe their coworker, right? We all say it's my partner, even though we don't usually even ride together in the same car. We believe we've seen it in TV 100 times and we think we have to call them our partner, even though we're not partners. And what do you see with teachers? What do you see with lawyers? My coworker, my friend, my colleague, totally different term. And it's because the culture teaches us that. And I think we need to get to the point where we reshape the culture a little bit, right? Because the thing about culture is it's a group process. And as we all interact with it, it changes. Like society itself has a culture. And I think the work that both of you are doing is to help shift the culture around things like active shooters. Like we can be better, not just in the response moment, but ahead of time, in the detection, in the reporting, in the culture that we set within our schools. Like that's power. And that's part of what I'd like to bring to the policing profession, not just around active shooters, but around mental health. It's not just let's do a new crisis line to catch someone at the last minute when they're already severely suicidal. It's let's rewind this all the way back to right at the start of training. And let's teach you how to take care of yourself and stay healthy, because that's what we need. We're going to send you to do really hard things. There's going to be trauma. There's going to be emotional pain. There's going to be danger. You're going to have your sleep disturbed, which is very detrimental to our mental health. But now here's all the healthy habits we're going to give you that will help you to get through this.
I feel like in forward-moving organizations, we're starting to get there. We're starting to have those conversations, and you hit it right on the head where everyone needs something a little bit different. And so it can't be a canned product, right? It has to be something that allows people to, what I need is different than John, is different than you, Mark, and we all walk through this stuff a little bit differently. But we know what is successful out there. We know the programs, and having those things being available so that you can, make it a priority. And I think we're starting to see that in some of our academies. In even some of the executive things, like when I was at the FBI NA, there's a whole course on wellness, and it really is not on the physical fitness side, but on the mental and emotional side. And so we're starting to see a movement in that. But again, it comes down to that age-old problem of you can bring a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. And so my thoughts were always, let's make it accessible. Let's make it accessible. Let's put it there. Let's put it there. And again, once you get that cultural change, once you get the cultural change of, hey, this isn't about me being weak. This is about me making myself better. This is about me preparing myself, mind, body, and soul. And you brought it up, right? We have no problem preparing for the physical side of this job. We have no problem preparing for the biomechanics, the shooting, and the defensive tactics, and all of that. And we work at it, and we work at it, and we work at it. This whole conversation about mental health and wellness, it's the same thing. We need to continue to work at it, have it accessible, like you said, make it a priority. And then, don't beat ourselves up for the bad days. When we stumble, let's move forward. On the good days, let's just kind of cherish what we did to keep us there, to keep moving forward, right? And just make it part of that routine, that daily routine of how we're moving through this profession. And then when you leave the profession and your life changes, you still have those, I talk a lot about the synapse in the brain, that go-to place that we go to, right? Those healing factors, those things that are there, it's already part of you, right? And it makes, I truly think, leaving the job a much easier transition. When I left, I thought, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? This is, and I haven't looked back. And part of it is because of those traumatic experiences helped me create a way to move forward. And leaving wasn't traumatic by any means, but it is a change in life. It is a major change. And it allows you just to continue to move forward almost seamlessly, right? Because you have that already instilled in you.
Yeah. Well, let me jump in. You said so much good there, AJ. So I'd like to touch on a few. You started with forward-moving organizations. You and I chatted a bit offline about this, but about the safety priorities, because ultimately it's something that I saw a massive change. Like I will say there were times I was advocating for change internally in my own organization when we were doing a lot more like dynamic type drug warrant type entries. And we sent some of our team leaders to learn from the NTOA and people like experts like yourself. And they came back and our tactics changed quite a bit. And I think everybody became safer because of it. Now, it's something I've advocated a little bit for internally, that I think we should teach the safety priorities to everybody. So before I go on to some of the other points, can I just ask your thoughts? Like, to me, you are a world expert on this topic, and I would love for you to share what you think from your experience about the safety priorities and how that fits within policing in general and within organizations.
Sure. I don't know about an expert, but I've spent the better part of my career trying to find a better way of decision making. And it comes down to that, right? How are we making decisions in critical moments? And, early in my career, it was a hodgepodge. And then you think you're making the right decision, and then you come back in an after action review and you just get eviscerated. And because it wasn't clear, everything was nebulous, right? And so way back in 2008, when we started to develop, this was a kind of two things were happening at once. Around 2008, a man by the name of Dan Murphy, he's a lieutenant up in Fort Collins PD here in Colorado, and a man, Steve Meskin, who is he retired here last year from Pittsburgh SWAT. And it really was kind of Dan and Steve's idea. I was just honored to be brought in to help develop it. We started to develop the SWAT team leader development course. There was never a course on that team leader level, right? And while that is taking place, parallel to that, I started working on our single officer response to an active shooter course. And initially, my chief at the time, he wanted it to be just for our school resource officers. And then when I presented it to him, he's like, no, we're going department-wide with this. All right. And so you try to figure out, how do we make a decision-making matrix, something that keeps us honest in what we're doing, that doesn't allow us to deviate from that. And it keeps everyone honest, not just the folks that are downrange working, but the people in the incident command, in the command post. And then later when we go back to look at it, to say, hey, look, how did we follow our procedures? Did we follow what we wanted to do, right? And so the original goal wasn't to create this, but it was the byproduct of it. And so team leaders kind of taken off, and we're starting to teach it, and single officer response is being developed. And I didn't come up with the concepts by any means. So you talk about life safety priorities, right? We also talk about intelligence, and we talk about environment. And so those were these things that were kind of just out there, right? Sitting in different spots. And really, life safety priorities were only for SWAT. It was a SWAT thing, and they were very, in my mind, they were a little bit short, right? Because that first one was hostages, the second one civilians, law enforcement, and then the suspect. And we've been taught that forever. I mean, I was taught that in my very first basic SWAT school that I went to in 1996. But I expanded that because I started to see value in, let's start to use this across the board, right? So safety priorities I looked at, and instead of saying hostages, which just narrows us down in scope, it's the only thing that really lets us think that we can be more fluid and dynamic in our actions, if you will. And dynamic doesn't mean fast, right? It just means tempo. It means maintaining flow of what we're trying to do. I expanded that to that first priority when we talk about that is anyone that is an imminent threat of serious bodily injury or death. That allowed me now to kind of push this into the department, away from SWAT, right? Away from SWAT and into the department where something that we can now use from the youngest officer all the way up to the chief. And the chief is more on the final decision-making and the after-action review and that executive. Commanders are those ones in the incident command that have to keep them honest on what we're doing. So broaden that from just hostages to anyone that's an imminent threat of serious bodily injury or death. And then, of course, the other ones we kept, civilians, law enforcement, and the suspect. By doing that, though, it allowed us to create an operational philosophy through the agency that we use that no matter what. We identify what that priority is. And once that priority is identified, every decision we make has to benefit that priority. And it's easy to invert these, and it's easy to slip unless we're 100% understanding that we can't deviate from the category. All right. And they're not in rank order by any means. And so put it in perspective. Anyone that's an imminent threat of serious bodily injury or death, allow SWAT, let's say that is a hostage situation. It allows SWAT to be much more dynamic in what they're doing, the tools that they're using, the methods, the methodology, all of that is very different than say it is a warrant service, or say it is because the priority would be different, right? But put it into the operational philosophy. Let's say the patrol officer. Active shooter is a great example. Active shooter, people are an imminent threat of serious bodily injury or death. It allows them to be much more aggressive and dynamic in what they do. And basically, an active shooter entry is a hasty entry on a hostage situation. You've got people that are being held hostage. You know, you can call it that or not, but it's true. They can't leave. They're in jeopardy. Allows them to be much more dynamic and aggressive in what they do. I mean, still today, in 2024, the best tactic in the world in an active shooter would be drop a SWAT team on it. But the lessons of Columbine is we can't wait, right? We have to be more, we have to do what's best for those that are in imminent peril, right? So we trained the patrol officers, gave them the ability to be much more aggressive and dynamic to move forward. Let's say something a little bit more simple. You have a rollover accident up on the highway. Those people are an imminent threat of serious bodily injury or death. We can say that. It allows the officer then to be much more dynamic in their actions, lets them run lights and sirens, which is not something that we do on a regular basis, but it is a dynamic, aggressive thing that we do. It may be aggressive is the wrong word, but you get what I'm saying. And they can articulate it. It is by far, well, other than last year, up until last year, more cops died in motor vehicle accidents, a lot of them running code, than by gunfire. Now, last year, I think that number surpassed it. But we can say, I need to be much more aggressive. I can articulate it, right? And it allows me now to go lights and sirens to get to where I need to do because people are an imminent threat of serious bodily injury or death. John squares off on me. He's a big dude. I can articulate that I'm an imminent threat of injury. I can then articulate why I went hands-on or used an intermediate tool, whatever it is, to be able to keep myself safe, right? And it's articulable. It is what it is. We look at civilians, that next priority. And the analogy I like to use is a barricaded gunman inside a community. He's inside the house. He's alone. No one's with him, and he's firing rounds out of the house, right? He's not our priority, our initial priority. Our initial priority is what? The civilians, where those rounds are falling. Patrol officers don't go kick the door and go get this guy. SWAT guys don't kick the door and go get this guy, right? Set a perimeter. We do, a lookout alert, reverse 911, red flag, whatever the heck you call it in your jurisdiction. Tell the community, hey, we've got a problem here. If you can self-evacuate, you feel comfortable doing that, doing it. If not, shelter. If it's a precarious area, we'll come get you and remove you from that premise because we slow it down, right? Then, at least at my agency, we would test compliance. Before we actually call SWAT, we probably would take, a part of the structure, maybe a window to create a communication portal, maybe an external flash sound diversionary device, something for this individual to say, listen, I'm not coming. You'd be amazed how fast people sometimes walk out when you break mom's window and they're in the house like, hey, quit, right? So it's just one more step before we call the SWAT guys. And when SWAT or ERT shows up, ERT guys show up, they don't kick the door and go get this guy. The main priority, the civilians have been taken care of. And now that next priority is law enforcement, right? And so we do it much slower. And we can articulate why we're doing it. And we communicate and we tell the guy, on a barricade, if it's a criminal barricade, there's no one else inside. We don't negotiate with that individual. It's more of a communication piece. Sir, you have 2 minutes to exit the structure. I can't ensure your safety. Well, I'm having a bad day. And well, sir, you got 1 minute and 50 seconds to come out. I mean, we're not going to negotiate. Hey, I'll give you a pizza if you give me. No, dude, you're in there by yourself, right? And so we have to understand jeopardy, and time on target is always a dangerous thing. So we want to be prudent in what we do. We don't want to be over aggressive, and at that 2 minute mark, when the guy doesn't come out of the house, what do? We launch gas. They don't kick the door. They launch gas, or they do some other thing to test compliance, right? He sits in there and he still doesn't come out. Maybe he fires a few more rounds. Maybe they launch another volley of gas. Let him sit there. He still doesn't come out. They start to deconstruct the house. No one's running in there because the priorities have been met and we're doing what we need to for law enforcement, right? Where we saw that change, you talked about warrant services. You know, when I got in early in my career, you know, a warrant service for drugs was hit the door and run like you were, you know, we were crazy. That was fun. It was fun to be able to go in there and do that, right? And also we started to realize, wait a minute, what's the priority here? The dope isn't the priority. That's the byproduct of an investigation. The priority on a warrant service are our officers. So let's slow it down and let's find ways to do this a little bit smarter in how we're doing and not put us at the top or put dope at the top, right? So it allows us to start to operate now with a little bit more fidelity and actually use tactics.
Yeah. Can I jump in for 1 sec there, AJ?
Yeah, go ahead.
Because something you said there, I really want to highlight the point. First off, like there's so much wisdom there. For everyone listening, like no joke, go listen to that again. We need this in our culture. We have a lot of places that aren't yet doing this, both up here in Canada sometimes and even down there in the US. And we really need this to get across in our culture. So please spread this message and actually make it a reality where you work. But what you just described about the going dynamic, the rushing in to get the drugs. Like when I started 10 years ago in the yurt world, that's what we were still doing. Okay. And I would have the debate on the team. We'd be at a training day and I would actually say to someone, there's a better way of doing this. Like I had enough knowledge of what the NTOA was bringing to say, I think we can do this better and differently. And I would have full on SWAT debates. And someone would say, you know, it's my job to put my life on the line for a Kia Coke. And that's what we signed up for. And you'd get this like tough guy mentality of like, what's the matter? Are you afraid? And so I would still be doing it with the team, but internally I would advocate for change. And it was when they went and heard this from people like you at the NTOA, from our leaders, that all of a sudden they came back and realized, wow, we got to change. And it was like a big change immediately. But I think there's still many other cultures that still really need, like policing subcultures, where they still think it's cool and it's tough and don't get in our way. Like we got to, without the drugs, when the bad guy gets away, like we got to shift our mentality. We got to be smart about this. We need to be preserving lives. Yes, even if it's suspect lives, definitely, like obviously officer lives that are being lost. And again, we can really shift that. But you also mentioned the rollover on the highway. Like to me, it really does apply so much. And that's one thing I think I'm starting to get a little bit of traction on in our agency is like, when do we pursue, right? Because as cops, we all want to catch the bad guy, right? It feels so good. And you can deviate from policy, but as long as you catch them, there's like quiet belly bumps and high fives, right? And that's what we got to get away from, because then all of a sudden someone dies and we just throw that officer under the bus. Can't believe they did that. That's terrible. And you're like, 100 other times we pursued when we shouldn't. No one said a word because we caught the bad guy. And then the one that goes wrong, we throw the officer under the bus. So I really do think there's a wide range of application for policing. And I think it's a part of the future of our profession. I think it brings us a better service to the public. I think it keeps everyone safer, both public, suspect, and officers. And to me, it should be mandatory for all agencies. And again, I don't have a lot of say in the matter. Like I'm a corporal in the RCMP. It's not a high rank. I don't actually have any say, but it's where I think people will listen to someone like yourself. So would you recommend that it's something that all police agencies should be using and implementing going forward to serve the public?
Without question. And let me just wrap this up really quick, because I that fourth category is the suspect. And sometimes I would get kickback on, why is that individual there? Well, we have to still take into account in the States, just like you, we take an oath to serve and protect, uphold our Constitution, all of that stuff, right? We can't deviate from that. And so that priority is there as well, right? And, it's something as not simple, but, it's an active shooting, and you step over 13 dead, beautiful souls that were alive right before this individual decided to do their act. You come around the corner and they're in the surrender position. All too many times, you hear guys say, well, I'm just going to shoot that guy. Well, yeah, if you want to go down to Canyon City, go to federal penitentiary, when they're in the surrender position, and I make them take an oath when they take my class, right? I will not break the law enforcing the law. I will not break the law enforcing the law. That individual then is treated in a certain way. But the power comes, Mark, in my mind, is understanding the priorities, understanding how they fit, right? Making that promise that once that priority is identified, every decision we make benefits that, and we're not going to deviate. We're not going to switch it up, because when we invert these things, we see failures. Coupled with then intel and environment. So that's the original PI model. Priorities, intel, and environment. Intel is what is actionable, not what maybe is. I mean, those are contingencies that we prepare for. But moment in time, what is actually actionable? Tactics are intel driven. What do I know moment in time? What is the focus of what I'm working on? And that is what tells us kind of what needs to be done moment in time. And then the environment tells us what our tactic is. If we understand all of that, right? And we could go back to, let's keep it in the rollover accident. The environment's telling me, I mean, I've got policy and procedure on how fast I couldn't go, drive lights and sirens over the speed limit. But the environment's actually telling me a little bit of that. Might be able to push it just a little bit more at 2:00 in the morning and there's no one on the roadway versus rush hour. I'm not going to go, I can't even get to where I would like to, even within policy. Say policy is 20 miles over the speed limit, lights and sirens, as long as I'm doing it with due care, caution, all of that, right? Environment's telling me what that tempo, what that speed is. And so environment dictates what I'm doing. And we can get into much deeper conversations when we start to talk about ERT and SWAT and what those tactics are, right? But once we understand that and we learn how to manipulate that environment, now we're much more powerful. And what it does is it sets us up to be successful in the beginning. It keeps, if it grows into a larger incident, we have incident command, it keeps those individuals honest, because we know sometimes that becomes problematic, because if they haven't grown up through the SWAT world or the ERT world, sometimes we have incident commanders that haven't had that exposure. So this allows them to have that matrix to keep them focused. They don't slip away from it, right? And then when we go back and look at it, it keeps everybody honest to say, okay, this is our philosophy. Did we operate within our own philosophy here at the agency? Did we deviate? Did we not? And so that's the total package. And if we can follow that, you'll see decision-making, you're empowering now. You're empowering those officers. You're giving them the ability to say, not just policy and procedure, but within policy and procedure, how do I get to the end goal? And now they have that matrix to be able to work their way through it. And again, that came out in 2008 when I was developing single officer response to give to our officers. And then NTOA adopted it right after that. And then a few years later, I mean, PI is copywritten under me. It's my baby and I get it. The NTOA changed it more for SWAT operations, and they added 2 additional steps, which I'm not going to get into, but they call it PI 2, pick the right tools out of your tool bag and then trust your instincts. And officer instincts is the PI O. And I debate those guys all the time. I think it gets a little bit scary when we start to talk about instincts, because your instincts are different than mine. And if I'm in, Timbuktu, someplace in the United States or even up in Canada, and I'm teaching a team leader or cops that don't have a lot of activity, that haven't had a lot of exposure, we can talk about your tactical competency, right? Your years on the job, your training, your real world experience, all of that comes into your competency. Some guys might have a higher competency than lower. And you're asking a guy that's had 2 call outs on a SWAT team in a very, low operational tempo place to say, hey, I want you to trust your instincts. Well, I don't know about that. I think that's how we create case law in the United States. And so I banter back and forth with Murphy and Meskin on that one. But I will say
this, that I found that the operational philosophy of PI to be really important also in supporting, frankly, good mental health. And there's a tie into that. So I would bring AJ in to my department and have him every year train all of my people on PI. I believe so strongly in that. But what for me it did, in some pretty tough circumstances and some pretty horrific cases, it allowed me to go back and say to myself, did I make the right decisions? And when you know that you had your priorities right, that you followed the priority, and you understood the intel and the environment, you're making good decisions based on that. It really helped me to find myself saying, I did what I could do. I made the decisions that needed to be made, and I'm good with that. That's empowering, and frankly, it's a good place to be, because then you don't find yourself questioning the what ifs, because you focused on what you needed to do, and you understood the why behind it, and now you're not in a position where you're looping in your mind constantly saying, but what if, but what if, but what if. And for me, I think there was a direct tie into PI to a lot of the incident command work that I did, and some of the rough stuff that we saw.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Let me mark just real quick, because I think this is important when what he's just talking about. And I say this a lot in my lectures or my courses that I'm teaching. The moment that you kind of realize you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't in this profession, period. And I can use Columbine as a great example of that, right? So we were sued 15 times. I was on a 5-year federal gag order. You are damned if you do, damned if you don't. If you have a matrix that you can follow that lets you know, hey, this is the priority. I did everything for that priority. This is the intel that I had moment in time, not hindsight 20/20 vision, right? Not from all the pundits and all that, but me there, boots on the ground in the room. This is the intel that I had moment in time, operating in this specific environment. That next morning, when half the world wants to praise you and half the world wants to burn you down, you're left just with yourself. You are left just with yourself. You follow that matrix. That next morning when you get up and you look yourself in the mirror, you know you did the best that you possibly could, as long as you're true to the matrix, as long as you follow that. Now, there's other factors that move in, right? But when I say you're damned if you do, damned if you don't, Columbine happens. Okay, so I'm in the music room. I've got 60 kids. Now, we believe there were 6 gunmen inside the building, barricading, taking hostages. We knew there were explosives in the building. I've got 60 kids. And about that moment, we get intel from one of our snipers that there's a sign in the window on the upper level, east side, southern exposure window, 1 bleeding to death. Well, I was the only guy in that area. And so I had to make a decision. I only had, a small amount of guys with me at the time. What do you break off into this? I mean, think about it. Unknown location, right? That's a stealth probe to contact compromise. Those always go bad if there's an ambush set up on us, right? We need a little bit more resources to be able to operate. So that intel piece became important for me, because we could say the 1 bleeding to death is an imminent threat of serious bodily injury. We could also say these 60 kids are, with 6 gunmen and explosives. I chose to protect the 60 because I didn't know, was it a ruse, the 1 bleeding to death? Was I getting set up for an ambush, or was it real? I had no way to verify that, but I knew these 60 kids were. So broke them up into groups of 10, had them shuffled outside, right? And eventually we find out at about the time I'm getting the last 10 out that the 1 bleeding to death was, in fact, it was real. Another element finally got there, tried to move. It was teacher Dave Sanders, tried to move him out, and he died. All right. So when I say you're damned if you do, damned if you don't, you ask the parents of the 60 that I got out, they say, thank you, AJ. You did the right thing. You got my 60 kid, my child, the most important thing in the world to me. You got them home to me. You asked the family of, or at least part of the family of Dave Sanders. They're like, screw you. You guys failed. And here's your lawsuit, right? So you, like I say, you're damned if you do, damned if you don't. If you follow this policy, not just is it good for the agency, because it keeps us all honest, it keeps us real, it allow all those things we talked about before, but now for your own mental health, You get up in the morning, you look yourself in the mirror and you're like, based off of this, this, and this, I did the right thing.
Yeah.
Moment in time, right? And it helps you then walk through those dark nights after that. And it lets you have some type of buoyancy, if you will, something that keeps you level when the heat comes and the pressure comes and the second guessing and the finger pointing and all of that. It just gives you more of a solid foundation to be able to walk through that stuff. And I think when people don't have that, and then coupled now in 2024 with all the mental health things we were talking about, all those things are available to us to keep us healthy, right? But when you don't have that, I think it can lead to much more devastating things.
Yeah. Well, let me touch on that a little bit, because I think sometimes we get into outcome-based decision making. So it ends up being, well, we don't like that outcome, so we're going to blame you. And you and I both know one of our mutual friends is Jordan McWilliams. So for those listeners who don't know this story, and I write about it in my book, Jordan's one of my best friends. And I got my spot on our ERT team because Jordan was charged with murder after shooting a hostage taker that pointed a gun at him. Now, we'd all think that could never happen, but it did, right? And it's because they don't understand the safety priorities. And ultimately, it's a travesty of justice. He got off, and it's now all done. He's back on the team and doing great. But I think we have to understand when we look at it as just what's the outcome. And okay, we got to recognize these are ambiguous and chaotic situations. This is why we need priorities. In a perfect world, we say, I pick everything and everyone is safe. Right. It's just not real. We have limited resources. We have multiple problems, and you aren't going to be able to do that. And I think what that can lead to, in my opinion, is shame and guilt, right? That's what we end up doing. And I'll say those were two emotions that I really felt. It was like, I'm a bad person. That's what shame is, right? Guilt is I did a bad thing. At the end of the day, if we have this framework that we can understand how we see our problems, that can really help us to know we did the best we could in that situation. And the best we could is not going to be perfect. Like if you think you're going to sign up for a 30-year career in law enforcement and never make a mistake, including in the most high-risk situations, I think you're unrealistic, right? And so we can't expect perfection all the time, nor do I think the courts should expect perfection. However, we should expect that we prepare for it. It's not just, we'll show up and hope it goes well. That's not a good plan. It should be that you've trained well and you're ready. But it really helped me to understand those feelings. And again, that comes back to the journaling. When I could express how I felt, it got some of that pain out of me, right? Because I carried a lot of shame and guilt, and I actually thought I'm a bad person. That's what I would say to myself. It took me years of saying, I haven't done anything wrong. I don't have anything to be ashamed about. Like I had to say that to myself for probably 2 years before I actually believed it. And now I do. That's what helped me to put my journaling out to the world, was I recognized it's actually helpful to others and I don't have anything to be ashamed about. And as we can show that vulnerability, because to put your hardships out, that is hard, right? That is being vulnerable. But vulnerability and courage are very strongly interconnected, right? This all ties into some of Brene Brown's writings about shame and guilt, but also about vulnerability and courage. Because so often we don't want to show any vulnerability. But even for you, like with a leadership background, if you're actually able to show some of your humanness, some of your vulnerability, when you make a mistake, to just say, you know what, I screwed up. I shouldn't have done that. I'm sorry. Like, wow, that's leadership. It's right. The leaders who just say, no, I don't think I screwed up. I probably told you about it at some point. You're like, that's not leadership. And that's right. How we start to change our culture internally, is we honestly help create good leaders.
Yeah, totally. No, and for me, showing those mistakes, I still do the debriefs, probably less and less. But when anyone calls and asks, I do the debriefs because those are cathartic. Talking about those things, talking about the decisions, showing, those after action reviews are more about the mistakes than what we did right. Those things are very, very cathartic. And I think there's one other point in here, though, that people forget, and they need to remember this. In these dynamic, rapidly evolving, tense, uncertain circumstances, all those things that you just talked about, the suspect always has a say. And we forget about that a little bit. we always think that it's kind of one-ended in what we're trying to accomplish. The suspect always has a say in how this is going to go. They can at some point become compliant. They can remain resistant. They always have a say, and we forget that. And we can have the best tactical plan in the world. Suspect is still going to be the one that's going to determine how that thing's going to end, because they always have a say in how it's going to go. And if you're up against, they talk about that 2%er, right? 98% of the population, no matter what, they're going to eventually capitulate and they're done. It's that 2%, they're the ones that are going to fight and are, have planned and prepared, and they have their own agenda that they're trying to get done as well. And we forget that. We forget that, no matter, we could do the best operational plan, suspect still has a say in how this thing is rolls out. And, our job is to limit those options and manipulate that environment so the suspect's plan is diminished, but they still have a say in how this thing is going to end up.
Let's take a break for a minute.
Yeah.
Defense, preserving property, protecting lives, providing peace of mind.
I want to touch on something about lethal force psychology, because we often want to count how many suspects have been shot by the police. And then that's often used in aggregate. We take all the statistics and we say, police shot 1,200 people last year. See, bad policing, failed de-escalation. And, I can give examples of like some of the calls my friends have been to, where someone's already killed 3 people and they're on their way to kill number 4 and they're actively trying, and the police get there and stop them. We don't count the number of people already murdered. We don't count the number of lives that we saved in our response. We just aggregate every one of these. We lump them in and assume they're failed de-escalation. And what you just said is a context people need to understand. Not every situation can be de-escalated. And if you're attempting to de-escalate at an active shooter, like there's active killing happening and your goal is to keep that suspect alive by de-escalating, like that's a bigger problem. But again, so much of training comes down to, we always got to de-escalate. We always got to communicate. Yes, whenever possible. But that's where I'll bring it back to safety priorities. It helps us to understand those differences. Now we can recognize officer-induced jeopardy. We're racing in there needlessly, forcing a confrontation, putting ourselves into danger when we didn't have to. Versus, hey, if we didn't do that, they were going to access this hostage, these civilians, and it gives people a model to make a better decision. Because often when I've looked at things after, like we find, a call really went badly. And usually it's that the safety priorities got inverted in one way or another, right? So it's either officer-induced jeopardy, you rush in there when you really shouldn't, or there's someone dying and you don't go in. But we're throwing like patrol level cops or frontline cops without that training, without that context, and they don't know how to make those decisions because we haven't given them a model. And I'll say, like, I just left frontline patrol capacity a few months ago, and back to this ambiguous, chaotic environment, there were times it's not even clear. And you just make your best estimate based on the information you have at the time. And you say why you're doing what you're doing. Hey, we're basing this on trying to keep people safe. And then we're going to go ahead. And we risk forcing a confrontation. But if we don't do it, we risk allowing that other person to die.
And let me take this just a step further. And sometimes using lethal force, that's de-escalation. That is the ultimate de-escalation, especially when we're looking at priorities, imminent threat of serious bodily injury or death. Someone is in the act of killing. That might be the only de-escalation that we have. Now, is it the preferred? Depending on the situation, right? And ask the people in the room, that become, grateful that that individual was stopped. And so we have to, understand that sometimes using that lethal force is de-escalation, right? And it's the ultimate de-escalation. Not our go-to thing unless priorities, intel, and environment are telling us that we have to. And that's that active shooting situation. That's that hostage situation. That's this individual that you talked about. They've already taken lives and they're in the act of doing it again. And it comes down to a simple question of, if it was your mom was the next one that was going to get taken, what do you want that officer to do? Do you want them to stop that threat immediately, or try to do something else? And then, we lose mom. And so that might be, really at its bare level analogy. But I think we need to understand that sometimes using lethal force is the appropriate de-escalation of the situation.
Yeah. Can I touch on one more part of that? And I don't know what you have found with the training that you guys do. But like Lieutenant Colonel Grossman, who I know you guys had on the show, awesome episode. Anyone listening who hasn't heard that, go back. Dave Grossman is one of the best experts we have in policing and police psychology, lethal force psychology. But I was thrown into some lethal force decisions without having read his books, without being aware of what he teaches. And I wasn't ready to make a lethal force decision, in all honesty. And I think that's actually somewhat common in the law enforcement profession, because we aren't really training people for it. I would argue that we largely have more of like a firearms training than a lethal force psychology training. And historically, they used to be much more marksmanship based, right?
Yes.
It's how tight is your grouping? How good does your piece of paper look? And when you watch YouTube videos of actual shootings, they look very little like our training does, right? And the better we can match our training to our environment, the better the outcomes we'll have. But what I think we need is to start teaching that stuff at the academy. So it actually brings us back to right before we got on safety priorities. You were talking about progressive organizations. And what it used to be is like, if you were lucky, you heard about, a Dave Grossman book or a Kevin Gilmartin, Emotional Survival for Law Enforcement. Eventually, we got to the point that we told you about it. Maybe we started even issuing it. Like my organization, to bring this back in, we have a reintegration program, and they will issue you On Combat from Dave Grossman, and they'll issue you Emotional Survival from Law Enforcement if you take the instructor version. Where I think we need to go as a profession, and where we're going to get, is that we start taking those concepts like the resistance to lethal force, or a whole whack from Gilmartin, the magic chair, the Ayusta, the two dads. He's got a whole bunch of really good stuff. And take like sleep science from, some of the best experts on sleep science and trauma and all these things. And we teach it to you at the start of your career. Instead of just, we hope that you read this book, we actually give you all these insights to make you, to give you the tools to make better decisions and to help you be a better officer. And that, at the end of the day, was my goal. All those books helped me, and I didn't know I needed them until I ended up in these spots. And I took, so say for my chapter on lethal force psychology, I took 600 pages of Dave Grossman and condensed it down to 20 pages with a story from me. Like that's kind of what I was trying to do for people. And my chapter on trauma is taking the best insights from like Bessel van der Kolk, The Body Keeps the Score. How do you take 300 words and now instead I'll give it to you in 10 pages with a little story of my trauma and my journaling. And same thing for sleep science. So that's where I see us going in the profession. Because personally, I think all of us, as we learn from our experiences, and we think, I wish someone had done that for me, right? I heard Dave Grossman say this on a podcast about, hey, we need to teach cops about sleep. Just hearing him talk about it motivated me to write an entire chapter, because I'm like, I wish someone had done this. And then at the end of the day, I went, then I should do it. And I think that's what you guys have done with your training around active shooter and all that you're doing. It's like, I wish someone had taught this to you before you had Columbine. But unfortunately, we didn't know what we didn't know. And that's okay. But now as we know better, let's try and do better. And let's help the next generation to solve these problems in a better way. Absolutely.
John, you've been quiet because I've been talking a lot. You got any thoughts on any of that?
I'm just taking it all in. I'm enjoying the episode. And I think, this is probably the most important part of all that responders do, is keeping your mind right. Because if you don't keep your mind right, nothing else matters. Nothing else works. life becomes miserable. And as our good friend Dr. Nicoletti says, and sometimes you create your own brand of misery. And, something I was thinking about, Mark, as you were talking, is that it's not a one size fits all, right? Journaling might not be for everybody, but I think the willingness to try what works for you, to find what works for you, it's like you go to a doctor and you don't like that doctor, go find a new doctor. You're trying to do something to get your mind right. If it's not working, then do something else and keep fighting that fight, because what's left is, if you don't do anything, you just give up, and that's unacceptable. So stay in the fight. And I think that's at least something I've taken away from this conversation today.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, AJ.
I was just going to say there's the realization, and the stuff is out there. It's just, how do you get people to, and it's all on a very individual level, right?
Mm-hmm.
We talked about before we got on, my buddy Bill Mumford, and just want to put that up there. That's what I was digging for earlier, right? My best friend, and we didn't have this understanding and the things available to us. And Bill took his own life. And I live with, still to this day, I was going to call him that night. My buddy, Mark Hemminghouse, who retired as a chief up in Dillon, and we always hunted together. I mean, that was our thing. And I'm sitting there, I was watching it was like a Monday night football game. The Broncos were playing, I think, the 49ers. It was snowing. And I'm thinking, hey, we're going to go moose hunting, because they just reintroduced moose back into the state. And we're going to go moose hunting. And I called Mark and I said, hey, what do you think? He goes, yeah, let's do it. Let's put it, because it's a big process. And we knew we'd have to get preference points, and it was going to take a long time. And I said, well, I'm going to call Billy and see if, make sure he's in, because it was a little bit expensive back then. And we didn't have any money. None of us did. We were just young cops. And I thought, it's getting late. I'll call Bill tomorrow. And I got woke up that morning by Mark actually saying, hey, Billy killed himself last night. And so you carry that with you, right? And part of that then becomes motivation to say, hey, look, there's got to be better ways. There's got to be ways that we can push this out, because suicide in our profession is still, it's way too high. One is too much. But if we actually look at the numbers, it's insane, with all the help, with all the stuff that is there. And so I think your book, right? I think your book gives people the opportunity to say, wait a minute, now this was Mark's journey, and this is what works, and this is what he learned from it, right? But it allows them to kind of create their own paths. And if we can just put somebody on the path of saying, hey, our mental health is our responsibility. And even on our darkest night, there's always tomorrow, there's things coming, there's things to look forward to. Then it makes the work that we're doing worth it. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, thank you for raising that. Thank you for showing Bill's picture and for honoring his memory. I'm really sorry for your loss. And it is such an important topic, because I really do believe we can change the outcomes if we make it a priority. And up till now, like, you'd know this, but how much do we invest in tactical training, right? For us in the RCMP, you get 26 weeks of training to be a basic cop. The one I went through, the JIBC in British Columbia, you get like 40 something weeks. And I'd say you probably get 4 hours of mental health training.
Yeah.
And as we know, we're losing so many officers to suicide, a much higher number than the other methods of death. But we're not really investing in it enough yet. And I believe we can change it. So obviously I have a chapter on suicide in my book, and it's because I've also lost a loved one to suicide. Now, it wasn't a police officer, but my godfather, Bill Jackson, I lived in a basement suite of his house for like 5 years, and I was very close with Bill. And I was the last one that spoke to him before he died from a suicide. And I didn't know anything about suicide. Honestly, I remember thinking something was wrong, and I saw a couple warning signs, but I didn't know they were warning signs. One of them was like giving your possessions away. So he came to give me some book that I didn't want, that I didn't know anything about, and he seemed all flustered. This wasn't the moment or the day it happened, it was before, but he was getting his affairs in order. And I just remember thinking, like, this is weird. What are you even talking about? I don't want this, but I didn't know. And now I would be screaming from the rooftops. Like, I would be very concerned. And on the day that Bill died, he came and saw me and asked me a question he already knew the answer to. And he seemed very flustered, not himself. And I remember the moment he left, I'm like, I should really talk to Bill and make sure he's okay and see how he's doing. And I never got the chance. And I'll say I carried guilt and shame over that. But since then, I've learned from all these psychologists, and there's so much good research. So first off, there's an organization up in Canada called CIPSRT, CIPSRT, and they do a lot of research. It's part of the RCMP's longitudinal study into mental health. Here's what they have found. Approximately 10% of police officers, RCMP officers, will have thoughts of suicide in a year. Okay, about 25% in the course of their career. Like, these are massive numbers. Okay, it's good to understand the scope of the problem, but now what do we do about it? So there's actually some really good other research specific to suicide and partially to policing. So one of them, for anyone who's not familiar, is Dr. Olivia Johnson. Okay, she has something she calls the Fatal 10, which I talk about this in my book. And her number 2 risk factors from studying like many hundreds of suicides of law enforcement. Number 1 is relationship breakdown. Okay, so it's like, can we actually teach people how to be better in their relationship so that they can stay healthy, right? And I would argue that we could teach things like the Gottman method and how to communicate better, how to connect. And number 2 is substance abuse, right? Essentially, I'll give you an example. Like, when I was a new cop, we'd finish shift and we would go sit and have beers at 6 a.m. in a parking lot in a car. And what we're seeking is connection. We're seeking people who get it, who've been through it with us, and we can talk about it. But it's really not a healthy way of doing it, right? If we want to go for a beer after on swing shift at the pub, awesome. But at 6 a.m. after a night shift, when our sleep is already highly dysregulated, probably not a good plan. And honestly, within our culture, we should probably shift away from that, which is why I talk about it now. There's some other awesome books. Dr. John Violanti, he wrote Police Suicide Epidemic in Blue. One of the things he found is the higher your rate of night shifts, the higher your risk for suicide. Now, it really makes sense, and it's part of why I have a chapter all about sleep science, specifically for shift workers at the end of my book, is because let's teach people this. Like, we're going to throw you into a career of night shifts, and we don't teach you how to regulate prescription sleeping meds and caffeine. And like, there's so much science that could help you to do it better. But we're just kind of like, good luck. Hope it doesn't go bad. And let's actually help people as they try and manage it. But the next one I want to touch on is a guy named Dr. Thomas Joyner. So he has a model, and he basically puts forward that there's 2 primary things: perceived burdensomeness and thwarted belonging. And when you combine those with an increased ability to enact lethal self-injury, that's who's really at risk and who commits suicide. I've just been reading a couple of his books lately. I actually got one here, Why People Die by Suicide. I just finished this. If anyone wants to know more about suicide, this is a fantastic book. And it really goes through all kinds of examples of that within the model. But here's the context to policing. So here's what I've heard. Officers who say things like their kids, for example, I heard one officer speak on a podcast. He's someone I know. And his kid said, "Dad, why do you hate me?" And what it is, this officer basically was traumatized. He'd been struck by a vehicle on duty. And then now you have rage, you have anger, like your family is impacted by it and they don't understand. And I've had moments like that when I need to apologize to my kid for yelling, that kind of stuff. So basically we perceive that we're a burden to others, and that's a really big problem. Right. The other one is that isolation, right? Or thwarted belonging. But policing, if you look at Gil Martin's work, we have a lot of cynicism, and we really can isolate. And isolation is such a key risk factor. And then the third part of this is that ability to enact lethal self-injury, where he essentially says people that have an acquired ability to endure pain, so that they do fearsome things. So like the military, police, like you go and you do hard things, it makes you, it likely increases your capability to do lethal self-injury. And then the last part of that is even the method. So something like a firearm, like attempting suicide by firearm, is such a high rate that people die from that. And obviously that's a lot of what happens in police suicides. So I really believe we could teach more about it in training. And Dr. Johnson talks about inoculation. It's not just prevention, it's inoculation, and that the opposite of suicide is truly wellness. So it's teaching people how to stay healthy. We hire amazing people that do amazing things in their careers, and let's actually tell them more about this problem and give them the tools to stay healthy. So when you go run into all these really hard things in your career, you come back to these habits. First off, a mindset of like, I'm human and that's okay. I can get through this. Even though this is hard and I'm hurting, I can get through this. And here's the habits I'm going to practice that will help me to get through it. I really believe we can change the outcomes. And the last thing I'll say on that, having spoken to someone like Dr. Nick Carlton, who's one of the head researchers for CIPSERT and with that study, he basically says, if we can change our coping strategies, if we can change our actions, we can change our outcomes. So yes, we have high rates of mental disorders, diagnosable mental disorders, PTSD, anxiety, depression, but it's not static. It doesn't need to stay that way. And if we can get people to change what they're doing, so if the answer isn't, let's go get drunk every night, it's, hey, let's actually go and be active. Let's exercise. Let's connect with others. Like normalize the healthy aspects. We can change the outcomes. That's both on the mental disorders, but I believe it's also on the suicide. So I appreciate you sharing that because, and I guess the last thing I'll say, and I share this in my book, is I hit a point that could be described as like passive suicidal ideation. Okay. I never thought of myself as suicidal, but I hit a point where I had so much pain in my life that I would envision my own death by suicide, like daily, regularly, right? And it was only after as I was basically finishing the book and I was talking to friends who are like podcasters in the mental health space, we started to really talk about it, that I finally felt safe being honest about it. But it's that so often we don't feel safe talking about it. And I really believe as we change our culture, we can change these outcomes together. So thank you for raising that.
Oh, you bet. Well, I think we've covered a lot of stuff, and I think, Mark, we're going to have you back on because there's a few more things I get to. But I think we've reached our listeners' breaking point. We try to keep these right at about an hour. We've been going over a little more than an hour, which is good. But any final thoughts, John, or anything? You've been quiet on this one.
I'm just taking it in. I'm really just soaking this in. It's so powerful and important. So thank you for joining us today and hanging out with us and sharing some pretty deep wisdom.
Well, thank you.
Mark, we've already been invited back up. It's next May to OTAB, where we're going to do these, I think a little bit differently. Want to talk to some of the folks that were doing the debriefs, but man, I would love to have you live. That's right. Since you're in Ottawa now, it's not too far from where you're at. So throw that on your calendar, and would love to have you there as a co-host as we talk about some of these things.
Thank you. It's a real honor. It's been such a privilege to get to come talk with both of you. I look forward every time a new episode comes out because I learn so much from it. You both have so much wisdom to share. So thank you for what you're doing to help reshape our culture. It really is making a difference. And thank you for the honor of getting to join you. And yes, I'll take you up on that. Absolutely.
All right. Perfect. Sounds good. Well, with that, I think we'll bring this one to a close. So traditionally, our toast, I've got my coffee. I think John's probably got his water or his Diet Coke, and you've got your water. So here we go. To us and those like us, the Centurions. Damn few left.
Damn few left.